Metroid Dread versus Prince of Persia: The Lost Crown. These are the two games we're pitting against each other today on this episode of Joey Pits Two Games Against Each Other Today. That's not an official title, it's just what I came up with right this second. But I decided to put this video together because these two games have of course been compared ever since Prince of Persia: The Lost Crown was announced, because they're both Metroidvanias, one of them even has Metroid in the name, fun fact, and they share similar art and gameplay styles, so I think it's only fitting to see which one of these games is better, just for the sake of seeing which one's better. I'm not trying to convince you to buy one or the other. In fact, you should buy both of these games because they're both fantastic in their own special way. Of course, Prince of Persia is not out yet, but I did get a chance to review the game early, meaning I played the entire game from beginning to end. I'm still on the quest to 100% it, but if you want to check out my review, then go ahead, it's up on the channel. But before you go and watch that, you should stick around until the end of the video to see which one of these games comes out to be the winner. And we're going to determine the champion by seeing how well they fare in 9 categories: combat, powers and abilities, exploration, map UI, puzzles, bosses, accessibility, story, and presentation. So let's jump right into the battle with the first category being combat, as these two games handle it very differently. And honestly, I don't think Metroid has really been remembered much for its combat systems, as they've been fairly simplistic. It's mainly just been shooting enemies in their weak spots until they die. There hasn't been anything really deep about the combat mechanics in these games. However, the latest line of Metroid games have really stepped up the combat department here with Metroid Samus Returns and, of course, Metroid Dread, which included the melee counter from Samus Returns. But not only that, they added a new ability called Flash Shift, which gave Samus a small boost of speed during some intense battles. I can safely say no other Metroid game has had combat much like Metroid Dread. But then we move on over to Prince of Persia: The Lost Crown, and the differences are quite a bit staggering. I say quite a bit because there's still some similarities from Metroid Dread. You can counter enemy attacks, although it's more difficult here because the enemies don't have obvious indicators that they're about to attack like in Dread. But what really makes Prince of Persia's combat stand out is how complex it is without being overwhelming for the player. I can say there is a lot of depth to Prince of Persia's combat, and you really begin to realize that when you go into the combat challenges that teach you new moves, and then you see just how many possibilities there are. There are so many different combos you can pull off. You can break shields if you hold down the attack button at the right time. You can also launch enemies in the air and keep launching them up in the air until gravity just takes hold of them. There is so much to Prince of Persia's combat that I could make an entire video about it. But just trust me when I say that the combat in Prince of Persia is just leagues ahead of Metroid Dread's combat. Neither of them have a bad combat system per se, it's just that Prince of Persia's is better. Now let's move on to powers and abilities, because you need those things in a Metroidvania game. There's nothing more satisfying than getting a power that gives you a new move, new attack, what have you, and then being able to open a pathway that you couldn't have before. It's the quintessential search action formula. And this gameplay style began with Metroid, and so it continues here in Dread with some captivating abilities. One of the first ones being the Spider Magnet, which really makes you feel like Spider-Man. Pretty sure I already made that joke, but I'm making it again. And then you move on and get more abilities like the Morph Ball, the Screw Attack, the Speed Boost with Shine Sparking. Let me tell you, the difference between playing Metroid Dread at the beginning versus the end is staggering. Samus feels like a completely different person when she gets all those materials, being able to jump around and Screw Attack all she wants. It's what I love about Metroid games, getting all those abilities and feeling like an absolute badass by the end. Prince of Persia, of course, has this too, with a total of 6 time powers that really change how Sargon moves in platforming sections. The ones I can talk about are the air dash ability, another one that lets him create a mark that he can warp back to, which makes for some interesting puzzles, and there's another one that lets Sargon trap items like bombs into another dimension, to which he can summon and throw them at an enemy or a damageable wall. A lot of these time powers are really cool, especially the air dash and the time warping ability, which makes those platforming sections a ton of fun, but I have to say, by the end of the game, you don't really feel too different. You don't really feel that much more powerful, because I mainly found these abilities useful in the exploration department, not exactly the combat one, aside from the air dash, which was great for dodging enemy attacks. So as cool and creative as a lot of these time powers are, Sargon largely felt the same at the end of the game as he did the beginning, which can't be said for Samus at the beginning to the end of Dread. So I have to say that Metroid Dread has the better powers and abilities thus far. Now, my favorite part of any Metroidvania game is its exploration. What's great about this genre is that it doesn't limit players to just a straight up linear path, even though the progression is more often than not a set path. That doesn't mean you're restricted to one lane. If you come across a fork in the road, you can take either way and see what you find. And if you missed something from earlier, you can always go back there later. But what is it that you find in these games? More often than not, it's the item pickups. Metroid Dread has all kinds of them. Missile expansions, energy tanks, power bomb tanks. It is rewarding every time you find one of these items because they just make Samus stronger. It is such a relief finding an energy tank because that means you'll have a better chance of surviving the next boss battle. And even though I sometimes groan whenever I find another missile tank, because let's face it, those things are always everywhere, it's still great to have those things, especially if you spam missiles like me. Prince of Persia seems to have a lot more things to find, from just straight up collectibles that are there for the sake of collecting, lore entries that give more backstory to the place that Sargon is in called Mount Ka, and the most important ones being amulets, Xerxes tokens, time crystals, and Damascus ingots. The latter three are especially useful back at shops where you can use them to upgrade weapons and health potions. Now, as for the amulets, you can only equip a set few of these at a time, and they give you passive abilities like increased arrow damage, a temporary boost in health, and my personal favorite, a shield that emits a bubble that slows down time. So you can find these amulets by buying them at shops or just exploring the world, but I have to say, finding any of these items doesn't feel nearly as rewarding as finding an energy tank or missile expansion in Metroid Dread. When I collect those items, I feel instantly more powerful. And if I had to choose between collecting an energy tank or collecting money to buy an energy tank at a shop, I'd always go for the energy tank every time. And that's where I feel like Prince of Persia sort of suffers in this category. You could be exploring a very challenging area only to be rewarded with money at the end, when you really want to be rewarded with something more valuable, such as a Soma Tree Petal, which is kind of like a piece of heart from Zelda that helps you increase your overall health. You won't find nearly as many of these valuable items while exploring Prince of Persia's world, because the majority of it is just filled with money to use at shops, which I get is helpful for building up Sargon as a character, but honestly, I prefer how Metroid Dread and the Metroid series as a whole does this with the energy tanks, missile expansions, and what have you. Moving on to map UI, because you can't play a Metroidvania without a map. I mean, you could, but do you want to? Metroid Dread's map is handy because, unlike in Prince of Persia, the map is always displayed for you at the top right. You can even set markers for places you want to return to. Even then, the map still tells you when there's an item nearby, or if you see an item you can't get to, it'll auto-mark it on the map anyway. Prince of Persia's map is very similar, although it doesn't automatically mark any items that you see, which is kind of a bummer, but not that necessary. But what really brings Prince of Persia's map a step above Dread's are the memory shards. These should be in every Metroidvania game. Basically, if you see an item you can't get to yet, you can hold down on the D-pad, and not only will it save a screenshot of the area that you're in, it'll mark it on the map so you can come back to it later, and then you can see what that area looks like. It's such a simple little tool, but it's so innovative that I have to give Prince of Persia this victory for map UI based on that alone. Now, as for puzzles, a lot of the ones found in Metroid Dread are environmental. Like, how am I going to get through this part? Oh, use a Morph Ball Bomb. How am I going to activate all these door switches at once? Oh, you use the storm missiles. But the best puzzles are the ones that utilize Shine Sparks, as you have to get the timing down right if you want to stay in Shine Sparking mode in order to run up steep hills. Man, I remember this one puzzle you're seeing right here. This took me a long time to figure out, and when I did, man oh man did it feel good. I have to say though, other than these few puzzles I just mentioned, I struggled to find any significant ones from Metroid Dread, but Prince of Persia, man, there's some really clever ones here. Of course, there are the platforming sections, which I guess count kind of as puzzles, because figuring out the timing of traps and such is a challenge in and of itself, but there are these time-based puzzles that I haven't seen implemented in any other video game, and I could honestly play an entire game based around them. Basically, they start a timer, and once that timer starts, you have to go do an objective like pull a lever or flip a switch, but then when that timer runs out, you're reset back to the starting point, only now a projection of what you just did will go out there and do what you just did, which will help your present self achieve another task. And then this will repeat a third time, in which you will hopefully complete that puzzle. It's very tough for me to explain, but just trust me when I say that this mechanic is absolutely incredible. I was thoroughly impressed with these puzzles, and just those puzzles alone make Prince of Persia: The Lost Crown the winner for the puzzle category. Next we have the bosses, and I will keep this one brief because ultimately Metroid Dread and Prince of Persia have very similar bosses, gigantic enemies with attacks that take up the entire screen. There's even some smaller scale enemies as well. That said, this is not a draw. There are no ties in this race. There is one clear winner here. While Prince of Persia has some really good boss battles that are aided by its excellent combat system, I have to say I like the ones in Metroid Dread more because a lot of them take advantage of the abilities that you gain along the way. Heck, if you even sequence break the game and you get the Morph Ball and bombs before you get to Kraid, that'll activate a new way to kill that dude. That is just really clever game design that rewards the sequence breaking. That's not to say that's the only reason why I prefer Dread's boss battles over Prince of Persia's, it's just that I think they're overall more interesting and do creative things with their arenas, such as the entire boss battle with experiment number Z57. That's probably one of the best boss battles in Metroid history. In fact, the Azdaha boss fight in Prince of Persia feels like it was trying to replicate that. Still a great boss battle, but not nearly as iconic. The boss battles from Dread in general just felt more memorable to me, and that's that they only brought back one returning villain in the form of Kraid. Not to mention there's a boss rush mode, which sadly Prince of Persia does not have, at least yet. Next we have accessibility. Come on, you know who's gonna win this. Prince of Persia has a detailed list of accessibility features, such as high contrast modes. There's also platforming assist, melee targeting assist, HUD scaling, alternative fonts. What does Metroid Dread have? Literally nothing. Nintendo games in general are not the most accessibility-friendly games. Hopefully that changes sometime in the near future, but as it is, Prince of Persia wins the accessibility battle by a landslide. Moving on to the story, this is where the less is more mentality sort of comes into play here. Prince of Persia: The Lost Crown has a very detailed story. There's a lot of voiced dialogue, there's all kinds of twists and turns that the plot takes near the end, and I said in my review that it has a very strong start. The characters are all great, the banter between them is fun, there's even a mystery they allude to where time moves differently in Mount Kof depending on who you are. A few days to one person, maybe a few hours to the main character, stuff like that, but it's all brought down to a whimper by the end. I can't really spoil anything here, but let's just say this story is not very interesting. The main character Sargon is a rather dull character, and by the end, even though the final boss battle was cool, I was kind of just like, okay, that happened. Dread, on the other hand, makes the exploration and the gameplay its primary focus, even though it does have a significant story, what with this being the conclusion of the Metroid story arc, which started all the way back with the first game in 1986. So there's all these details brought up about Samus's origins, her being raised by the Chozo race of aliens. It's all fascinating stuff for a Metroid fan, but on its own, it's still kind of fascinating, really. The only words of English are spoken by the computer Adam, as everyone else speaks in the native Chozo language with subtitles, and you're not constantly bombarded by cutscenes. Yeah, you talk to Adam pretty consistently, but it's not for too long, and the revelations that are revealed to Samus are quite impactful. So even though story isn't Metroid Dread's main focus, I still vastly prefer it to that of Prince of Persia's, which was just doing way too much with its concept and sort of just became confusing. What with all the time elements, whenever you put that in a script, it's gonna wind up messy at some point. Finally, one more category: presentation. We're talking about the graphics and the sound, the music, all that good stuff. Keep in mind when we talk about Prince of Persia, we're primarily talking about the Switch version of the game, even though it's available on other platforms, because if we're comparing it to Metroid Dread, which is a Switch exclusive, I think it's only fair. And honestly, for a third-party game, Prince of Persia looks and runs pretty darn good. There's still some sacrifices made from the more powerful versions like the PlayStation 5. There's some reflections that aren't there, the textures aren't as clean, but overall, it's still a very smooth experience with some great visuals made in the Unity engine. I have to say though, I'm a little disappointed in the soundtrack, as it was composed by one of my favorite video game composers, Gareth Coker. He's one of the two main composers on the game, and honestly, I struggle to find a track in here that was memorable. I guess it's partly by design though, because the soundtrack by and large is mostly atmospheric. It really blends in with the other sounds in the game, so it's not that noticeable. But like I said, none of it really stood out to me, and which is disappointing because I loved his work on the Ori games, and I was hoping he could really stretch more of his music making muscles with Prince of Persia, but instead we got a rather quiet soundtrack that is still good, just not incredible. But speaking of disappointing soundtracks, this is kind of weird. Metroid Dread kind of has one too. Metroid has had some iconic music over the years, and Dread sort of misses that mark. Most of the songs sound like diet Metroid music, if that makes sense. It definitely sounds like a Metroid game, but it doesn't have that oomph, you know, those memorable melodies that we've been hearing for the past 30-something years. Even still, I much prefer it to the music from Prince of Persia, because for one, it has way more of a presence in this game than the music in Prince of Persia has in that game, and there are still a few standout tracks, namely the Persia theme, because underwater music in Metroid just simply does not miss. And sometimes the Kraid theme will come up in my head, and I'm just like, okay, alright, there we go, get hyped. But as for visuals, both games actually look quite similar. They're cel-shaded, they're definitely more animated in that style, and I also feel like they have similar lighting too, what with those god rays and some of the backgrounds, just absolutely gorgeous stuff. But comparing the two, Metroid Dread definitely looks cleaner. It certainly helps that the game is made only for the Switch hardware, without the need to scale it for like PS5 or something. And in general, the backgrounds of Metroid Dread have more life coming out of them. With Prince of Persia, I never really noticed anything interesting in the backgrounds of those areas, aside from a very impressive area that I cannot show you here, but trust me, you'll know it when you see it. Even still, Metroid Dread makes better use of background foreshadowing, hinting at what boss you're gonna fight next. There's even a lot of wildlife back there too, which I didn't really notice in Prince of Persia, aside from the occasional bird or what have you. So I have to give the overall presentation to Metroid Dread. Which, if we do the math correctly, Prince of Persia won the categories of combat, map UI, puzzles, and accessibility. Those are 4 categories, but Metroid Dread took home 5 categories, those being powers and abilities, exploration, bosses, story, and presentation. Which means the champion of this battle is, of course, Metroid Dread, which is understandable because Metroid practically invented this genre, so you would hope that they would wind up mastering it by this time. Either way, I still gotta give props to Prince of Persia: The Lost Crown. It is still a fantastic game that you should play if you are into this genre. Heck, even if you just played Metroid Dread, this game kind of feels like a pseudo-sequel to it in some ways. But thank you so much for watching this special video here on GameXplain. Be sure to let me know if you agree or disagree with the winner here, and until next time, bye-bye.